Hey loves, my name is Amber, welcome to my channel, and today we're going to be discussing Five Little Pigs, a Hercule Poirot mystery by Agatha Christie. If the name Five Little Pigs doesn't sound familiar to you, it may be because the book was originally published previously as Murder in Retrospect, which, like, if we're being real, is such a better name. Like, they really downgraded by calling it Five Little Pigs, if we're being honest. Before we get too far into this review, I did want to mention a few trigger warnings that were relevant to the text, including mentions of affairs, poisoning, murder, and suicide. So if any of these things are liable to be incredibly bothersome or triggering to you, please have extreme discretion while watching the rest of this review or reading the book. I also did want to note, for any readers who may not be familiar, Poirot is a very common character that is featured throughout Agatha Christie novels. Like, there's an entire Hercule Poirot series, and this is definitely not the first one by any means. So I was definitely personally, like, very afraid that if I read this one without having read any of the others, that I was going to be a little bit lost. And that definitely wasn't the case. Like, this was perfectly readable as a standalone, and I definitely didn't even realize that there, like, was potentially other context or content that I was missing. So if you have any interest in reading the book for yourself, you definitely don't have to have experience with the series itself. Within the book, Carla Lemarchand hires Hercule Poirot to investigate a 16-year-old mystery of which her mother is convicted of murdering her father, a famed painter. While her mother died a year after the conviction, she did leave behind a letter for Carla to open once she turned 21, claiming her innocence, of which Carla is convinced. Hercule Poirot is intrigued by Miss Lemarchand, so he agrees to take on the case. He proceeds to have discussions with each of the 5 individuals who were also in the home at the time the death occurred, as well as have them chronicle their own version of the events that transpired. Based on the eyewitness accounts, Poirot is able to piece together the what and the why of what he believes truly happened on the day of the poisoning. Alright, so I was very, very pleasantly surprised that this book was as easy to read and follow as it was. It was a book that was published in the 1940s, and in my particular experience, I don't have the best time reading older works. It's just not my style, and it's generally, like, pretty hard for me to follow, and this was not at all the case. Like, this could have been written more recently. I mean, you can definitely tell that it is a little bit older simply because of the overall vibe and aura of what exactly is happening within the book, but it wasn't, like, difficult to read by any means. It was so easy to follow and fairly well written. So I was so pleasantly surprised that it was honestly, like, a really good reading experience. I was left interested in the story and genuinely wondering what the reveal was going to be until the nearly last page. We got the reveal, like, I'd say probably like 3 or 4 pages from the end, or like the ultimate reveal at least. There are definitely, like, multiple, as will happen throughout most mystery books. But I was definitely, like, genuinely left wondering and guessing, and didn't personally actually guess the outcome myself. The concept of a murder being investigated and followed so many years after the fact was honestly, like, such a fantastic idea. And I just felt, like, really original, especially so many years later, is so just fun to see. Because, like, nowadays it feels like we've had some version or another of just about everything. So for an idea to, like, truly feel kind of original isn't very common for me these days. And I definitely thought that it was so original and refreshing and just fascinating to read about. And the format in which the book was presented, because we start the book, it's Carla Lemarchand approaches Poirot and is like, hey, like, I want you to investigate this murder. You're the best. You're the only one who can do it. And while, like, Poirot is definitely a little bit cocky, I assume within the series it makes sense. This is definitely, like, not his first rodeo. And I have to assume, based on the narrative of, like, this type of series that he's probably more successful than not. So he's definitely cocky, but probably deservingly. And so he's like, yes, like, you fascinated me, like, I am the best, I'll take this case on. And so he goes and he interviews and discusses the case with a variety of different people who were involved with the case from the outside. So, like, I believe some of the officers that investigated, some of the judges and lawyers and things like that. Like, more on the judicial side of things. He went and interviewed a few people who were vaguely familiar with the case. And then he got the 5 eyewitnesses who were actually involved and present at the time of the poisoning. And he tracked all of them down and had kind of like face-to-faces with all of those individuals and convinces all of them to give like written accounts of their story of what happened on that day. So then we get to read each of their recounts of the events, and from that, Poirot was able to deduce what he believed happened, and so he gets all of these people together and presents his story that he is able to piece from everyone's overall narrative. And just the format in which it went down, I feel like, again, was just so original and fascinating to witness. I'm super into it. Like, I definitely want to read more Christie in the future, because this is, for like reference, this is the first Agatha Christie novel that I've ever read. I got this in the July Down the Rabbit Hole book box they were kind enough to send me. So if y'all have any interest, I have a whole unboxing of a bunch of bookish goodies that went along with the reading of the book, including some of what I have thrown in the back for props. I digress. This is the first Agatha Christie novel that I had ever read, and I definitely think I want to look into more of her work to see if it holds up and is just as good as this one, or if this is one of the more shining stars. But I'm gonna have to assume not, because I've never actually heard the name of this one, whereas like so many other of her pieces are like household names almost, like Murder on the Orient Express, Death on the Nile, etc., etc. There's definitely like much more famous works of hers, so that leads me to believe, hopefully, that those are just as good, if not better. As much as I do love the narrative itself and the entire concept, I will have to say that you do have to maintain a slight suspension of disbelief while reading, simply because the book the book takes place 16 years after the initial mystery, and for so many facts and memories to be recollected in the way that they were, it does feel a little bit unrealistic. Like, you're not going to be remembering that much from any one particular day 16 years later. And they do definitely, like, play around with that concept a little bit. Poirot definitely uses a few, like, psychological tricks to help people remember certain aspects, including, like, smells and different things to spark memories. And there's also, you know, one particular character who kind of says, you know, like, honestly, that day wasn't, like, any different from any of the rest of the days that summer, with the exception of the murder. And, like, even remember certain events, like, later in the fact, and was like, oh, I didn't even realize that that had happened on that day, because it all just blurred together. Because, obviously, it was 16 years ago. But it's definitely not difficult to maintain that suspension of disbelief while reading, so it evens out. As much as I would have liked for the murder to have maybe not been quite so long ago, so the recollections were a little bit more believable, it wasn't necessarily a detriment to the book either. It was fine. One thing of note within the book that I found to be just, like, kind of interesting was that I felt like Christie's characters, particularly female characters, felt like they were written by a man. And, like, not necessarily in a detrimental way. I'm just trying to figure out if I think it's because, like, that is actually just Agatha Christie's writing style and how she thought about particular characters, or if it was done more so as a way to kind of mimic male writers who at the time of publishing were definitely taken much more seriously than female writers. Honestly, even today it happens. And I obviously, like, I don't know if I will ever have an answer to that. I just found it to be notable that it was just very curious that, like, the characters felt kind of like they were written by a man versus a woman. I'd be very curious to see how the Poirot series compares to her other famed series, which follows a female detective. If it's more similar, or if, like, you can tell, like, one was meant to be from the perspective of a man versus one being from the perspective of a woman. And again, you know, with this characterization, it could just be that she was trying to exemplify the, like, how a male character would see female characters. In which case, like, I definitely didn't feel like it was bad writing by any means. I was just very curious because I couldn't quite tell the intent behind it, you know? Was it intentional? Was this just how you felt because it was the 40s? You know, what have you. Another thing that I did want to note, and this isn't like a major thing by any means, it's just like from a modern lens. Throughout the book, it like the theory of the character who had been poisoned had committed suicide is mentioned many times throughout the book, and it's always met with the response that, like, oh, he wasn't that type of person, like, he wouldn't have, there's no way, blah 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 blah. But especially the fact that, like, oh, he wasn't that type of person. And from a modern lens, like, we definitely know that that is not necessarily the case. There are so many individuals who struggle with mental health issues or even just, like, acts of impulse that do result in self-harm, that it's really unfair to, like, assume that, like, they're not the type, because you really can't assume that somebody is or isn't the type. And obviously we know that from a modern standpoint that are much more sympathetic to mental health struggles. And again, obviously this was the 40s, like, this definitely wasn't like a major issue that I took. I did kind of just want to take a moment to bring it up and just be like, yo, you can never assume. Maybe check on the people that you think are okay, you know? And again, speaking of looking at things from a modern lens, there were a couple of comments that were made throughout the book that, like, I can't tell if they're racist or not. And, like, based on the book and the context, it definitely doesn't feel like it was intended to be offensive in any way, but it also doesn't necessarily feel entirely PC, and it's, like, certainly not things that, like, would be said in books that were published now, probably. So I'm just like, I can't actually tell if that's racist or not, because too, like, it doesn't need to be, but it also could be. So, you know, there are just, like, a few comments, and definitely not very many. I think honestly only like 2 or 3. And then very casually mentioned throughout the book. So I'm just like, I don't know if that would be cool nowadays, but, like, it doesn't, like, it certainly wasn't meant in an offensive way. So overall, I genuinely enjoyed this book so much, and so much more than I was anticipating. Like, I really didn't have very high expectations for the book, simply because it is an older novel, and of course, like, just because a novel is old doesn't mean that it's going to be bad by any means. However, with my experience reading older novels, they haven't been my favorites, whereas this is one that I definitely feel like I will read multiple times in the future. Honestly, at the point of doing this review, I have read it twice now. I read it, and then I was going to film the review, and then I waited a few days, and I was like, honestly, I kind of want to read it again. Simply to see, like, I wanted to see if I could see any more of the, like, mystery reveal setup now that I knew what the actual, like, mystery reveal was. And I definitely say it's worth a second read if you know what happens in the ending, because there are a few things that are, like, put down here and there to where I'm just like, oh, like, I know what's gonna happen now, but I wouldn't have, and I didn't the first time I was reading it. So I would definitely recommend reading it twice if you're gonna give it a go, simply because, at least if you like it the first time around, definitely read it again, because I thought it was just fun to see that I was like, oh, like, you knew what you were doing from the start. Not all authors do. or not all authors sound like they do. So it's fun when you can definitely tell that like Christie had a clear, concise idea while she was writing the entire novel. But anyways, thank you guys so much for watching. I had a blast hanging out with y'all. Peace.